In the sweltering haze of a Louisiana summer in 1853, where the air hung thick with the scent of magnolias and the distant crack of whips, young Eliza Hawthorne lived a life of porcelain dolls and forbidden whispers. Daughter to the iron-fisted plantation owner, Elias Hawthorne, she was destined for a marriage of convenience and a legacy stained by the blood of those her father called property. But in the shadowed corners of the cotton fields, Eliza's heart had entangled with Jeremiah, a strong-willed enslaved man whose eyes held the fire of distant freedoms and untold sorrows. In the heart of Antebellum, Louisiana, where the Mississippi River wound like a serpent through vast fields of cotton that stretched endlessly under a relentless sun, Eliza Hawthorne grew up in a world of opulent isolation. Born in 1835 to Elias Hawthorne, a man whose fortune was built on the backs of hundreds of enslaved people, Eliza's life was a carefully curated facade of Southern gentility. The Hawthorne Plantation, known as Willow Bend, sprawled across thousands of acres, its grand white columns and manicured gardens hiding the brutal machinery of human bondage that sustained it. Elias was a towering figure, his face etched with lines from years of commanding obedience, his voice a thunderclap that silenced rooms. He ruled with an iron fist wrapped in the velvet of paternalism, believing firmly in the divine order that placed him at the apex and those he owned at the bottom. Eliza, his only child after her mother's untimely death from fever, was raised to embody the ideals of a Southern belle, demure, educated in the arts of needlework and French, and destined for an advantageous marriage that would expand the family's holdings. From a young age, Eliza chafed against the invisible bars of her existence. Tutored in the airy parlor by a spinster governess, she devoured forbidden books smuggled from the North, tales of abolition and equality that painted her father's world in stark, unforgiving light. Yet, it was not ideology alone that stirred her rebellion, it was the human connections that pierced the veil of separation. The enslaved people on Willow Bend were omnipresent yet invisible in her daily life, tending the gardens, serving meals, and laboring in the fields that funded her silk dresses. Among them was Jeremiah, a young man of 25, born into slavery on a neighboring plantation and purchased by Elias for his strength and skill as a blacksmith. Jeremiah's frame was forged from years of toil, his muscles corded like the roots of ancient oaks, but it was his mind that set him apart. Self-taught in secret, he could read scraps of newspapers discarded by the overseers, and his eyes, deep, expressive pools of mahogany, held a quiet defiance that spoke of dreams beyond the chains. Their first encounter was innocuous, a chance meeting in the stables one crisp autumn morning in 1852. Eliza, sneaking out for a forbidden ride on her mare, startled when Jeremiah emerged from the shadows, hammer in hand, repairing a horseshoe. "Miss Eliza," he murmured, dipping his head in the required deference, but his gaze lingered a fraction too long, curiosity flickering like a hidden flame. She, flushed with the thrill of her minor transgression, asked about the horse's ailment, and he answered with a knowledge that surprised her. What began as a polite exchange evolved into stolen conversations. Over weeks, Eliza found excuses to visit the forge, a loose bridle, a question about saddle care. Jeremiah, cautious at first, sensing the peril in bridging their worlds, gradually opened up. He spoke of his mother, sold away when he was a boy, of the songs sung in the quarters that carried coded messages of hope, of the North Star that guided runaways to freedom. As seasons turned, their meetings deepened into something profound and dangerous. Under the canopy of weeping willows by the riverbank, away from prying eyes, they shared whispers in the twilight. Eliza confided her loneliness, the suffocating expectations of her father who paraded suitors before her like prized livestock. Jeremiah revealed fragments of his inner world, the ache of lost family, the rage simmering beneath his composed exterior, the clandestine network of whispers among the enslaved about the Underground Railroad. Their differences, stark as night and day, only fueled the attraction. Eliza saw in Jeremiah a vitality absent from the pallid gentleman of her class, a man whose spirit remained unbroken despite every effort to crush it. He, in turn, found in her a compassion that humanized the oppressors he had learned to resent, a spark of allyship in a sea of indifference. But love in such a divided world was a spark on dry tinder, threatening to ignite catastrophe. Elias Hawthorne's rules were absolute: no fraternization, no mercy for those who blurred the lines. Rumors of uprisings in other states made him paranoid, leading to harsher overseers and midnight floggings as warnings. Eliza and Jeremiah knew the risks. Discovery could mean Jeremiah's sale or worse, a whipping that would scar him for life, while Eliza faced disownment or forced marriage. Yet, the pull was irresistible. In hidden groves, their hands brushed, then clasped, sealing a bond that transcended societal decrees. One evening, as fireflies danced like errant stars, Jeremiah pressed a carved wooden locket into her palm, etched with a crude map of the stars leading north. "For when the time comes," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. This forbidden affection crystallized into resolve. Eliza, witnessing a brutal punishment in the fields, a young boy lashed for dropping a bale, vowed change. Their clandestine rendezvous turned strategic, plotting routes through swamps, identifying sympathetic allies in nearby towns, gathering supplies pilfered from the house. Jeremiah's knowledge of the land, honed from years of forced labor, complemented Eliza's access to maps and money. The plan took shape amid stolen kisses and fervent promises, a desperate bid for a life where love wasn't a crime. By early 1853, as spring bloomed with deceptive beauty, their secret was a ticking bomb, ready to explode into flight. The bond, once a whisper, had become a roar, propelling them toward an uncertain horizon where freedom beckoned, shadowed by the ever-present threat of recapture. The night of June 17, 1853, arrived like a judgment. A violent thunderstorm rolled in from the Gulf, turning the sky into a bruised cauldron and the air electric with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Lightning forked across the heavens, illuminating the plantation in stark flashes that revealed the white columns of Willow Bend like the bones of some ancient beast. Inside the great house, Elias Hawthorne had retired early after a day of furious arguments with his overseer over falling cotton yields, his snores rumbling through the upper halls like distant thunder. The house slaves moved silently, extinguishing lamps and banking fires, their eyes averted from the young mistress who lingered too long in the shadows of the veranda. Eliza's heart pounded so fiercely she feared it would betray her. She had spent the afternoon in a fever of preparation, her hands trembling as she packed a small bundle, 2 plain wool dresses stolen from the laundry, a pouch of silver coins lifted from her father's desk, hardtack and dried beef pilfered from the kitchen, a flint and steel, and the carved wooden locket Jeremiah had given her. She wore boys' trousers beneath her skirt for the ride ahead, the coarse fabric chafing against her skin in a way that felt like the first honest touch of the life she was choosing. At midnight, when the storm reached its crescendo and rain lashed the windows like thrown gravel, she slipped down the back stairs, past the sleeping cook, and out into the deluge. The world beyond the veranda was chaos. Water streamed in rivulets down the gravel paths, turning them into rivers of mud. Eliza pulled a dark cloak over her head and ran toward the stables, her shoes sinking with every step. Lightning revealed Jeremiah waiting in the doorway, a shadowed figure holding the reins of 2 horses, a sturdy bay mare for her and a powerful gelding for himself, both saddled with blankets and minimal gear to avoid suspicion. His face, usually so composed, was taut with tension, rain streaming down his cheeks like tears. Without a word, he helped her mount, his hands lingering on her waist for the briefest moment, a silent vow in the storm's roar. They led the horses quietly through the side gate, past the quarters where dim lantern light flickered behind shuttered windows. The enslaved people inside knew something of the plan. Whispers had traveled through the grapevine for weeks, but no one stirred. To be seen aiding runaways meant the whip or worse, yet in the darkness Eliza felt their silent blessing, a collective breath held for the 2 who dared what most only dreamed. Once beyond the last fence, Jeremiah swung into his saddle and they urged the horses into a canter, heading west toward the dense cypress swamps that bordered the plantation lands. The storm was both curse and salvation. Rain erased their tracks almost as quickly as hooves made them, and thunder drowned the sound of their passage. Yet the darkness was near absolute, broken only by lightning that showed tangled roots and sudden drops into black water. Eliza clung to the mane of her mare, trusting Jeremiah's lead as he navigated paths known only to those who had worked the land under punishment. They skirted the main roads where patrols might ride despite the weather, plunging instead into the bayou's labyrinth. Spanish moss hung like ghostly curtains, brushing their faces as they passed, and the air grew thick with the rot of decaying vegetation and the sudden cries of night birds startled by their intrusion. By dawn, the storm had eased to a steady drizzle, and they were miles from Willow Bend. Jeremiah guided them to a hidden clearing deep in the swamp, a place he had scouted months earlier, an island of higher ground surrounded by water too deep for hounds to cross easily. There they rested briefly, eating cold rations while the horses grazed. Eliza's body ached from the unaccustomed ride, her thighs raw, but exhilaration overrode pain. For the first time in her life, she felt the sharp edge of true freedom, terrifying and intoxicating. Jeremiah scanned the horizon constantly, his blacksmith's shoulders tense beneath the soaked shirt clinging to his skin. "They'll know by morning," he said quietly. "Your father won't rest till he has us back, or proof we're dead." He was right. Back at the plantation, chaos erupted with the rising sun. A house slave discovered Eliza's empty room, the bed unslept in, her finest dresses untouched. Elias Hawthorne's roar shook the rafters as he summoned the overseer and every able-bodied man. Hounds were loosed, trackers mounted, and word sent to neighboring plantations. Rewards were posted before noon, $500 for the return of his daughter unharmed, $200 for the captured slave Jeremiah, dead or alive. Patrols fanned out along roads and riverbanks, torches smoking in the damp air. But Eliza and Jeremiah were already moving again, abandoning the horses at a predetermined spot where a sympathetic free black farmer waited to hide the animals and misdirect any pursuit. From there they traveled on foot, following faint trails known to conductors of the Underground Railroad. The escape had begun in earnest, a fragile thread stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, with bloodhounds baying in the distance and the weight of an entire society's wrath pressing down upon them. Every step north was a defiance, every mile a miracle, as the storm that had cloaked their departure faded into memory and the long, perilous journey unfolded under a merciless sky. As the days blurred into a relentless march northward, the initial thrill of escape gave way to the grinding trials that would forge or shatter Eliza and Jeremiah's fragile alliance. The swamps of Louisiana swallowed them first, a primordial maze of stagnant water and twisted cypress knees rising like skeletal fingers from the murk. Mosquitoes swarmed in thick clouds, their bites raising angry welts on exposed skin, while the constant humidity turned every breath into a labored gasp. They waded through knee-deep sludge, Jeremiah leading with a stick to probe for hidden sinkholes, his blacksmith's strength tested against the sucking mud that threatened to claim their boots, and them, with every step. Eliza, unused to such exertion, felt her fine hands blister from gripping vines for balance, her once pristine skin chapped and raw. Food was scarce, the provisions from Willow Bend dwindled faster than anticipated, forcing them to forage for edible roots and berries Jeremiah identified from childhood lessons in the quarters. One night, hunger gnawed so fiercely that they risked a fire, roasting a scrawny possum caught in a snare. The meat was tough and gamey, but it sustained them, even as the smoke drew unseen eyes in the darkness. Beyond the swamps lay the open roads of Mississippi, where danger wore human faces. They traveled by night, hiding in barns or thickets by day, their ears attuned to the distant baying of hounds or the clatter of hooves. The Underground Railroad provided sporadic aid, a Quaker farmer here, a free black conductor there, who offered bread, water, and whispered directions to the next safe house. But trust was a luxury they could ill afford. In a dingy cabin near Vicksburg, they sought refuge with a man named Silas, rumored to be a staunch abolitionist. He welcomed them with hot stew and dry blankets, his eyes gleaming with what seemed like genuine fervor. Yet, as they slept, exhaustion claiming them deeply, Silas slipped out under cover of darkness to alert a local sheriff, tempted by the swelling reward posters that had spread like wildfire across the South. Jeremiah awoke to the creak of the door, his instincts honed by years of vigilance saving them. He roused Eliza with a hand over her mouth, and they fled through a back window just as lanterns bobbed in the distance. The betrayal stung like a whip slash. Eliza wept silently as they ran, her faith in humanity fracturing, while Jeremiah's face hardened into a mask of resolve. "Not all who smile are friends," he muttered, pulling her deeper into the woods. Starvation stalked them relentlessly as they crossed into Tennessee, the landscape shifting to rolling hills and dense forests that offered cover but little sustenance. Rains turned paths to quagmires, soaking their clothes and chilling them to the bone. Eliza's body, softened by a life of ease, rebelled with fever and cramps, forcing halts that Jeremiah chafed against. He hunted when he could, snaring rabbits or fishing in streams with improvised lines, but often they subsisted on wild onions and acorns, their stomachs twisting in protest. One desperate afternoon, they stumbled upon an abandoned orchard, gorging on overripe apples until sickness overtook them. It was here that Eliza first truly confronted her privilege. Watching Jeremiah portion out the scant fruit with meticulous care, she realized the depths of deprivation he had known all his life. Their conversations, once filled with dreams of a free future, turned raw, arguments over pace, over risks, over the very feasibility of their love in a world that deemed it unnatural. Jeremiah's patience frayed, his voice sharp as he reminded her of the chains he had worn, while Eliza's tears spoke of her awakening guilt and determination. The climax of their ordeals came in the rugged Appalachians, where bounty hunters closed in like wolves on a scent. Word of the runaway heiress and her enslaved lover had traveled far, fueled by Elias Hawthorne's unyielding pursuit and the allure of gold. Near a mountain pass in Kentucky, as autumn leaves turned the ground to a carpet of crimson, a skirmish erupted. 3 rough men, armed with rifles and knives, ambushed their camp at dawn. Jeremiah fought fiercely, his hammer, salvaged from the forge, swinging like a weapon of old, cracking one assailant's arm with a resounding thud. But a blade found its mark, slicing deep into his shoulder, blood blooming dark against his shirt. Eliza, hidden in the underbrush, emerged with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, wielding a branch like a club to fend off another attacker long enough for Jeremiah to disarm the last. They escaped into the mist-shrouded peaks, but the wound festered quickly in the cold, Jeremiah's steps faltering as infection set in. Eliza took charge then, her hands steady despite the terror coiling in her gut. She tore strips from her petticoat to bind the gash, boiling water over a hasty fire to cleanse it, drawing on half-remembered lessons from her governess about poultices and herbs. For days, they holed up in a shallow cave, Jeremiah delirious with fever, murmuring of lost kin and unkept promises. She foraged alone, risking exposure to gather willow bark for pain and yarrow to staunch the bleeding, her nights spent bathing his brow and whispering encouragements. The role reversal tested their bond to its core, Jeremiah, the unbreakable force, now vulnerable, while Eliza shed her naivety like a snakeskin, emerging tougher, more resilient. Doubts crept in. Had she dragged him into folly? Could they survive the North's unknowns if the South's ghosts wouldn't release them? Yet, in the quiet moments, as his fever broke and strength returned, their touches reaffirmed the fire that had sparked their flight. The journey's trials had stripped them bare, revealing not just the perils of the path but the depths of their commitment, as they pressed on toward the Ohio River, freedom's threshold looming amid the scars of survival. After 6 harrowing months that felt like an eternity carved from peril and perseverance, Eliza and Jeremiah finally crossed the invisible line that separated bondage from the promise of liberty. The Ohio River, a watery barrier swollen by late autumn rains, had been their final formidable obstacle. They forded it under the cover of a foggy dawn, guided by a grizzled ferryman affiliated with the Underground Railroad, his lantern a dim beacon in the mist. As the northern bank materialized, solid and unyielding beneath their weary feet, a profound silence enveloped them, no hounds baying in pursuit, no crack of whips echoing from distant fields. Jeremiah, his shoulder scar a puckered reminder of their trials, squeezed Eliza's hand, his calloused palm rough against her now toughened skin. "We're here," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief, as if uttering the words might shatter the fragile reality. The North unfolded before them like a foreign tapestry, its colors muted by the encroaching winter. They emerged into the outskirts of a small settlement in southern Ohio, a cluster of log cabins and modest farms huddled against the chill winds sweeping down from the Great Lakes. Named Eldridge Hollow, it was a haven for fugitives, whispered about in coded messages passed along the escape routes. Abolitionists here operated in quiet defiance, their homes marked by subtle signs, a quilt pattern draped over a fence, a lantern in a specific window, that signaled safety to those who knew to look. Eliza and Jeremiah were directed to a sympathetic widow, Mrs. Abigail Thorne, whose husband had been killed aiding runaways years prior. Her farmhouse, with its thatched roof and smoke curling from the chimney, offered their first true respite since fleeing Willow Bend. Exhaustion claimed them upon arrival. Mrs. Thorne provided hot cider and cornbread, her eyes kind but probing as she assessed the unlikely pair, the refined southern lady with dirt-streaked cheeks and the broad-shouldered black man whose gaze held the wariness of the hunted. "You've come far," she said softly, bandaging Jeremiah's lingering wounds with herbal salves. They slept in a hayloft that night, the scent of dried grasses a balm after months of damp earth and fear-soaked hides. For the first time, Eliza dreamed not of pursuit but of possibility, a life where she and Jeremiah could build something untainted by the South's shadows. Yet, even in this sanctuary, freedom felt tentative. Laws like the Fugitive Slave Act loomed, empowering bounty hunters to cross state lines, and whispers of spies infiltrated abolitionist networks kept everyone vigilant. As days passed, they integrated cautiously into Eldridge Hollow's rhythm. Jeremiah found work in a blacksmith shop, his skills earning him respect among the free black community that clustered on the village's edge. Eliza, disguising her accent and background, assisted Mrs. Thorne with sewing and chores, her nimble fingers adapting to mending fences as readily as embroidering linens. The settlement buzzed with stories of others like them, families reunited after daring escapes, individuals forging new identities in bustling cities like Cincinnati or further north in Canada. But beneath the surface calm, tension simmered. Racial divides persisted even here, while abolitionists preached equality. Prejudice lingered in sidelong glances and segregated pews at the local church. Eliza grappled with her role, her white skin affording privileges Jeremiah could never claim, stirring guilt that sometimes strained their quiet moments together. It was during a gathering at the village tavern, where locals shared news over tankards of ale, that the whispers began. An old trapper, his beard flecked with frost, spoke of a remote cabin deeper in the northern woods, abandoned since a tragic event decades ago. "Folks say it's cursed," he rasped, his eyes darting as if invoking spirits. "Built by settlers in the War of 1812, but something dark happened there, massacre, some claim, or worse. Ghosts of Shawnee warriors, or runaway slaves who met a bad end." The tale intrigued the crowd, but for Eliza and Jeremiah, it held practical allure. They needed a place to lie low. Rumors of Elias Hawthorne's agents scouring Ohio towns had reached Eldridge Hollow, and Mrs. Thorne urged them to move on soon. The cabin, isolated and forgotten, promised temporary refuge while they planned their next steps, perhaps to Canada, where British soil offered surer freedom. Drawn by necessity and a morbid curiosity, they set out after a week, provisions in knapsacks courtesy of the community. The journey took them through dense forests where skeletal trees clawed at the gray sky, leaves crunching underfoot like brittle bones. Snow flurries danced in the air, a harbinger of the harsh winter ahead. Jeremiah led, his sense of direction unerring, while Eliza carried a map sketched by the trapper. As they delved deeper, the woods grew eerily silent, wildlife scarce, as if the land itself held its breath. They spoke little, the weight of their shared history a comforting anchor amid the unknown. The cabin appeared at dusk, a dilapidated structure sagging against a rocky outcrop, its windows like empty sockets staring into the gloom. Vines strangled the walls, and the door hung askew on rusted hinges. Inside, dust motes swirled in the fading light, revealing remnants of past lives, a shattered lantern, tattered quilts, and walls etched with faded carvings, symbols that Jeremiah recognized as African wards against evil, mingled with native markings. A chill unrelated to the cold settled over them as they lit a fire in the hearth, shadows leaping like specters. Whispers seemed to emanate from the very timbers, faint echoes of screams or laments, but they dismissed it as wind through cracks. Believing themselves safe at last, they settled in, unaware that the cabin's dark history was no mere folklore. Buried beneath the floorboards lay secrets of a failed slave revolt from years prior, where betrayed fugitives had been cornered and slaughtered, their unrest lingering in ways that defied the grave, waiting to ensnare any who dared disturb the restless peace. As the fire crackled in the hearth of the forsaken cabin, casting flickering shadows that danced like tormented souls across the warped wooden walls, Eliza and Jeremiah allowed themselves a fragile moment of relief. The air inside was thick with the musty odor of decay, mingled with the faint, acrid tang of old smoke, as if the structure itself exhaled memories long buried. They had barricaded the door with a heavy oak beam found rotting in the corner, and Jeremiah busied himself inspecting the room for any signs of recent habitation, none, save for the thick layer of dust that coated every surface like a shroud. Eliza unpacked their meager supplies, her fingers numb from the cold that seeped through the cracks despite the blaze. "This place will do for now," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space, trying to infuse optimism into the words. Jeremiah nodded, but his eyes lingered on the strange carvings etched into the beams overhead, symbols that twisted like serpents, some resembling the protective wards he recalled from stories told in the slave quarters, others alien and foreboding, perhaps remnants of indigenous peoples who had once claimed these woods. Night fell swiftly, the forest outside plunging into an impenetrable blackness broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of unseen creatures. They shared a meal of hard biscuits and jerky, sitting close on a pallet of musty blankets, their bodies seeking warmth and reassurance in each other's presence. Conversation turned to plans, forging papers in a nearby town, perhaps joining a community of free blacks further north, building a life where their love could flourish without the specter of recapture. Yet, as the hours wore on, an unease settled over them like frost on glass. Whispers seemed to emanate from the walls, faint at first, indistinguishable from the wind whistling through gaps in the logs. Eliza dismissed it as fatigue, but Jeremiah, ever attuned to the subtle warnings of the world, felt a prickle along his spine, a sense that they were not alone. It began with a loose floorboard. In the dead of night, as Eliza shifted in her sleep, her elbow pressed against it, eliciting a hollow creak that reverberated through the cabin. Jeremiah, awake and vigilant, knelt to investigate, his knife prying up the plank with ease. Beneath lay a hidden compartment, its edges caked in grime, revealing a cache of artifacts that chilled the blood in their veins. Yellowed papers, brittle with age, scattered like fallen leaves, letters scrawled in frantic script, detailing a clandestine gathering of runaway slaves in 1832, plotting a revolt against pursuers who had tracked them to this very spot. Names leaped from the pages: Ezekiel, a leader with visions of armed uprising; Mara, a woman who had poisoned her masters well before fleeing; others whose stories mirrored Jeremiah's own. Interspersed were crude maps of escape routes, marked with crosses where ambushes had failed, and a blood-stained cloth wrapped around a rusted shackle, its iron teeth still sharp. Deeper in the void, Jeremiah's hand brushed something cold and unyielding, a small wooden box, its lid engraved with a circle of thorns. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay a collection of human teeth, each one notched as if for tallying, and a lock of hair bound with twine. Eliza gasped as he held it to the firelight, her face paling. "What is this place?" she whispered, but the answer unfolded in the documents they pored over by the dim glow. The cabin had been a way station on the Underground Railroad, but betrayal had doomed it. A turncoat among the group, promised freedom by bounty hunters, had led a posse here under cover of night. The revolt turned massacre, slaves cornered, fighting with improvised weapons, pitchforks, stones, their bare hands, against rifles and dogs. Accounts spoke of screams that pierced the forest, bodies dragged into the woods and left for scavengers, but not all had died swiftly. Some were taken alive, tortured for information on other routes, their agonies etched into the walls as warnings. As they read, the whispers grew louder, coalescing into discernible words: pleas for mercy, curses upon traitors, names called out in despair. The fire sputtered unnaturally, flames leaping high then dimming to embers without cause. Jeremiah felt a cold hand brush his neck, invisible yet tangible, sending him scrambling back. Eliza clutched the locket he had given her, its carved stars now seeming like eyes watching from within. Shadows in the corners thickened, taking shapes, elongated figures with outstretched arms, faces contorted in eternal rage. The air grew heavy, pressing down like an unseen weight, and a low moan echoed from the compartment, as if the earth itself groaned with the burden of unrestful dead. Panic seized them. Jeremiah slammed the floorboard shut, but the disturbances intensified, doors rattling on hinges, the beam barricade shifting as if pushed from outside. Eliza's screams mingled with the cacophony as apparitions materialized, translucent forms of the slaughtered, their wounds gaping, eyes hollow with accusation. They pointed at Jeremiah, recognizing in him a kindred spirit, yet resenting the freedom he had grasped where they had failed. One spirit, a woman with chains dangling from ethereal wrists, whispered of a curse: any who disturbed their grave would join them, bound forever to this liminal hell, their souls fodder for the vengeful. The cabin, it revealed, was no sanctuary but a trap, its history a magnet for the damned, drawing in fugitives only to ensnare them in spectral chains far crueler than iron. In their terror, Eliza and Jeremiah fled into the night, but the woods twisted around them, paths looping back to the cabin's glow. Exhaustion and fear blurred reality, the ghosts pursuing with relentless hunger, their chilling revelation dawning. Escape from the South had delivered them not to freedom, but to a purgatory where the horrors of slavery echoed eternally, claiming them as its own in ways neither whip nor master ever could. The locket burned against Eliza's skin, a beacon for the unrest, as the forest closed in, whispers turning to howls that promised no dawn would break their nightmare.